Thank you to everybody for joining us for this session. This is a series of online hangouts that we do with Sigma Xi's distinguished lecturers. I'm Fenella Saunders. I'm the executive editor of American Scientist magazine. And today we are being joined by Paula Raymond, who is a professor of sociology at the University of Massachusetts Lowell. And although, Dr. Raymond, you have a diversity of interests, today we're going to be focused on gender equity in STEM fields, which is one of your areas of interest. I just will mention as an introduction that in addition to being a professor, you're a director of the Middle East Center for Peace, Development, and Culture, executive director of the Public Sector Hub of the Women in Public Service Project, which is housed at the Woodrow Wilson International Center, and the founding director of the Peace and Conflict Studies program at UMass Lowell. In terms of your involvement related to women in science, you were principal investigator for the National Science Foundation's project Women and Tech Forced and Working Wise, Women in Science and Engineering, and co-author of the Equity Equation. So thank you so much for joining us today. We're really pleased to have you. And I know that this topic is one that is very prominent in science right now, as well as amongst our membership. So I think that this is going to be very elucidating for all of us.
Thank you.
So maybe just as a way of getting started, maybe we could just discuss the state of the sort of the workforce that makes up STEM fields now. I know that there's still an underrepresentation of women, minorities, and the disabled population within STEM. So maybe you could give us a few statistics on that just to get us started.
I think that the issue of achieving equity and fairness in STEM fields is something that has been a challenge for our nation for a very long time. I have to say, have been very hopeful that given the expansion, particularly in technology fields in the last 30 years, that there was a potential promise to fulfill equity in the pipeline, first of all, from K through 12 students, to have not just girls, but also our underrepresented groups of Latinos and African Americans, Native Americans, differently abled people, um, people with different sexual identity orientations, um, become more included within these emerging fields. I think one of the most challenging and I would say upsetting um, issues has been that we have not made the progress. And I'll just give you an example. In computer science, which really was born in the 1980s and 90s, we were very, very hopeful that this new emerging field um, of IT, information technology, and computers would open up new doors for underrepresented groups. And indeed, in the 1990s, this began to happen. About 38% of all people in computer science fields, particularly on the low entry levels, um, began to be underrepresented groups. However, what we were hoping for was to have really this field, as it expanded, to allow there to be what we call internal market ladders for people, so that they could progress up towards not just being professors of computer science, but moving from data entry people all the way through the system. It did not happen. And so we find ourselves here in the year 2017 with less than one quarter of our computer science field um, representing women. Um, in terms of African Americans, we're about at 9%, which is, if you look at the population as a whole, at about 16%. So um, that is not good. And in terms of Latinos, we have about 3%. And the higher you go in the hierarchy of jobs and payment of jobs, the less the field looks inclusive. So that's just an example. Um, we find a different pattern in science and engineering, and that, in a just quick way to summarize, is that people are segregated in various fields. So, for instance, while we have more women and underrepresented groups entering environmental engineering, we are still way below representative levels in electrical and nuclear engineering and other fields. The same holds true in the sciences. Um, Women are now about 50%, 51% of biology, but if we turn back to the so-called hard sciences of chemistry and physics, there's a great lag behind. Um, so one way of putting it is we still have a long way to go. One statistic you might find a little humorous, but still kind of to keep in our head, if we kept going at the turtle pace that we're going right now, it would be the year 4024 before we achieved equity for just women as a group, and it would be even farther in the future for some of our other underrepresented groups. And I can't even count how many great, 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 great grandchildren generations that would be from now, you know.
Well, I hope that doesn't happen, certainly. So I'm glad we're talking about ways that we might increase that pace. But just to talk a little bit and give people some data, I mean, I think that all of us know anecdotally that having a diversity in a team of scientists or anybody else, really, for that matter, can be very useful for reasons other than just having diversity in terms of different backgrounds, different ideas, levels of creativity. I've interviewed a lot of Sigma Xi's distinguished lecturers. I always ask them about their experiences with diverse teams. Everyone that I've interviewed said that having a diversity of backgrounds and abilities helps you with problem solving. But I wondered if there's any data about that to really sort of hit home the point that having a diverse team in science or really anywhere else really is a benefit to the field for reasons other than just because it's the right thing to do.
I'm so glad you raised that because um, while it is not just politically correct or morally correct to create justice for all in our democracy about people being able to enter all fields, we've had things like Title IX that have opened up, for instance, sports to diversity. Um, there are other very important reasons, and you've really asked two questions. I mean, one, or actually, you've given one answer and raised a question. Um, we know, oops,
I think you're good.
I can't see you any longer, but can
Oh,
you see
okay.
me?
I can see you. Yes, I'll see if Heather can figure out why you can't see me.
Okay, I'm going to continue talking then, as long as you
Can you
can.
hear me?
I can hear you fine.
Okay.
It's just the camera off. Um, So I'll continue that. You are absolutely correct, Fenella, that um, we know from studies that have been done early on, and they were small pilot studies by the National Research Council years ago in the 1990s, that when you bring a diverse group of people around the table, there's more innovation. And this was done with product development. And I'll give you an example. Um, IBM, when it was first developing some hardware for computers, asked both men and women to do some designing of the hardware, and the kind of rectangular square configuration that we have was largely produced by men. And when women and some of the underrepresented groups were brought in around the table, they produced hardware that was more elliptical or oval in shape that allowed two people rather than one person to be working on a computer at one time. This allowed there to be more co-production of information and exchange, and it's just an example of that. And I still don't know why they didn't wind up producing more of those, but it's an example. And there have been, however, really a dearth, not a sufficient number of control studies or scientifically valid studies that have brought home the point that you raised, which is um, while there's been a lot of anecdotal evidence from different people, I've met with the president of HP, for example. I've met with the head of Starbucks, other people that have found that diversity indeed has a positive effect on productivity. But we haven't done, I think, the level of homework and the level of dissemination of that fact that would really allow not just the Fortune 500, but medium and smaller sized businesses to really take that truth and run with it.
That's an interesting point, and I actually wonder how that might be quantified in a way. I mean, I think one of the points that I've heard a lot of people say is that when you have a diverse team, uh, it actually helps you break out of the assumptions you're making that you don't even know you're making. Um, so
Mhm.
it's like you have these perceptions of the world that you don't even realize you have until somebody challenges them. But how might you quantify something like that?
Well, we have, I think, some literary expressions of that. Evelyn Keller wrote, her famous book of Barbara McClintock and how Barbara thought out of the box in when she was looking at corn and became a Nobel Prize winner of looking at cell development in a very different way than many of her colleagues. And of course, we have the famous study of Rosalind Franklin and DNA, and she was really the crystallographer who came up with that design, although she did not get her reward as the two men, Watson and Crick, did at the time. Those are, again, stories. What you're talking about are more large scale studies, and I think it is curious to me. I really don't know the answer of why there hasn't been more investment in trying to do um, ongoing studies of this in different plants, because I think you're absolutely correct that having that verified in a seamless scientific way would be very helpful for all of us in promoting why this is important. And I also want to add another dimension of this that was raised to me years ago by Rita Caldwell when she was the president of the National Science Foundation, that this is also an issue of national security, that we need all talented minds to be working on issues in the broadest sense of keeping our nation safe, and that we um, need to be thinking of how to create pathways, not just for young people, uh, girls, children of color, children of immigrants, differently abled, all those people to feel like they can play a role in this. But we have to find sustainable ways to retain these people. So it's both attracting people and retaining people in these fields. And that means having teachers who are welcoming to people. My own story was when I was in high school, I was told very clearly that girls did not go to places like MIT. You couldn't wear a dress and go to MIT. That was kind of a double whammy there. It was before pantsuits were invented, I suppose.
Right.
But but also I think that to disallow that kind of discouragement early on is stage one. And then stage two is to have welcoming workplaces. And again, in the broadest way, we have found from an earlier study that I did of pathways for women in the sciences at Wellesley College that many of our underrepresented groups of women felt very committed to making a difference in their lives through their workplaces. And they often thought of scientific fields as so called nerdy fields or fields that did not serve the public except for medicine. And one of the things that we have to do a better job in, and when I say we, all of us that are concerned with equity issues and justice issues, national security issues, and also productivity issues that you've raised, is we have to be able to sell the message, disseminate the message widely that you truly can make a difference, that you can be a change agent in going to the wide range of science, technology, engineering, and math fields. There's no doubt about that. And other countries, if we look at their statistics, are doing much better on this than we are.
Interesting. Yeah. So you're talking there about making a difference, and I know that one of the areas that's important here is mentorship, and having people who are already established, pulling up other people, and trying to make sure that the people that they pull up are not necessarily the same as they are. But there was a study recently, and I wondered if you had any thoughts on this, where for anecdotally speaking, one of the problems that young people often mention is that they don't see anybody like themselves in this field, so they don't have any role models. But there was a recent study that showed that people are actually sometimes better mentors when they have a different experience than the person they're mentoring, because they don't sit there and say, well, I went through it and so you can tough it out too. So I wondered if you had thoughts on those kinds of results.
Oh, I'm so glad you raised that. In the research that I've seen on this, on mentorship, Kitty Didion and AWIS, the Association for Women in Science, did some excellent work on mentoring years ago. Um, the um, sense of who is your mentor did not rely on, for instance, women having women and men having men. What was important about the mentoring experience was the relational quality of that mentorship. So it meant if you truly had somebody that encouraged you. I know that for myself, some of the most important people in my own life, as I was getting a degree in economics, labor economics, is that I had terrific male mentors who believed in what I was doing and felt that I could do as well as anybody in the class. I was one of two women in my graduate program in economics at the time, so I was clearly a minority. Um, but that encouragement was key. And then a number of years later, when I had my first professional opportunity of teaching at Wellesley College, um, we came up in pathways for women in the sciences that had been funded by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. Um, the finding that there were three words that were really important in this mentoring experience, and they were encouragement, encouragement, and encouragement. So, like, real estate, where you talk about location, 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 um, it was the quality of encouragement. And so, one of the new programs we started when I was at Wellesley, that might be interesting to the people that are listening to this, is that we, during orientation period, right in the beginning of people's college experiences, um, reached out to the parents, um, and we found that bringing both fathers and mothers and the other people that were part of the young person's family life into this discussion and having them become part of the encouragement team alongside of teachers in the classroom. And then we brought in employers for our seniors later on so that they could understand how important it was for them to continue that message. And I think that's a very good point that you've raised, Vanilla.
Well, I'm glad you talked about having teams of mentors there. I don't know if you know Jadida Eisler. She runs a program called Vanguard STEM, and she's one of the first women to receive a PhD in astrophysics. First black women, I should say. But she has pointed out the importance of having what she calls a board of directors, so that you have more than one mentor. So you're not getting all the mentorship you need from one person. It's rare that you'll be able to do that, but you have to be able to take pieces from different mentors and kind of piece together one optimal mentor out of a whole group of people. So I'm glad to hear that's an interesting take.
Yes, I mean, I think that's that notion of it takes a team is very important. Also, um, dynamics. I mean, people have many different jobs and even careers in one lifetime now. We're living longer. People constantly need to be retrained. You need to kind of take along the spirit of your former mentors, but bring it in the new workplace. One thing that I learned a few years ago from Kathy Moynihan, who was one of our first women in the Federal Reserve banking system, one of the wonderful gifts that she brought into her workplace, which was a traditionally very white male workplace, was that whatever level she was at, she not just mentored the people around them, but she left a critical mass behind. So it wasn't just a singular woman or a person of color having to hold up the fort, so to speak, but rather a critical mass of people at that level that they then could continue to mentor the people behind them. And as she moved up the ladder, she did this all the way through. And the legacy results of that were enormous and very important. So, just another way of thinking through something that you've raised in a very good way.
So that actually is a really great segue into the next part of the discussion I hope to have with you, is discussing some of these problems that have happened with some of these equity interventions that have not proven to be sustainable or scaled up. There have been a number of them, and the efforts kind of peter out after a while. I was wondering if you felt that part of the reason for that lack of sustainability had been because of maybe a gatekeeper effect or too much dependence on a single champion, or some other kind of limitation in that sense.
All of the above. Check all the boxes. I mean,
Right.
a famous example, Dudley Hirschbach, the Nobel Prize winning chemist at Harvard, came up with a fabulous idea called resurrection points. He had found that students coming to Harvard, where everybody was bright and everybody was above average and all of that, um, when they came to Harvard, the environment in organic chemistry among the faculty was to see how many people they could throw out in a fast way. So it was a very discouraging environment. And Dudley turned that around with doing something called resurrection points, where he invited students that weren't doing so well to come in, get some peer tutoring. He set up a peer tutoring program. And if they achieved their goal on their second wave of tests, they could always improve their overall score, hence the name Resurrection. However, to your point, when Professor Hirschbach left Harvard, that whole system collapsed and was not kept up because the culture itself, the larger culture, hadn't changed. And it means that you can have a champion, whether they be a chancellor, a president, the head of a corporation, but if they're out and it hasn't been institutionalized within the deep roots and framework of that environment, it's not going to be sustainable. And we know this about climate change. We know this about many science problems that we deal with. Um, and if we want to create sustainability, we're really talking about a paradigm shift, as Thomas Kuhn has referred to it, a structural paradigm shift that would create internal incentives to keep on the momentum going, um, where people have to come up with institutional wide plans that reach all segments of the population in that institution. So, for example, not just at the dean level, not just at a chair level, that we're talking now universities, in corporations, not just the COO, but really it has to be woven through the quilt of the institution so it becomes as important metric as a profit margin or as important metric of retention of your highest students so that diversity isn't a lag behind metric, it becomes part of the fabric of where you are. And I think how to do that has been a major challenge. The advanced program at NSF, which was fabulous in creating institutional change one by one, however, was not successful in producing um, a way of replication. Each institution needs to do this by itself, but we didn't find a way to really translate the successes from one institution to another. So a new program um, that I know I sent you some information about, which we are just beginning to launch now at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, called Sea Change, which is STEM Equity Achievement Awards, is going to be challenging American institutions to create plans for themselves so that they can go for a bronze award, and then once they implement it, a silver award. And you don't get the gold award until you have outreach to other institutions and help them along with their own planning. It's meant to be a nationwide program to do what you talked about, Fenella, which is something that is um, uh, true and lasting at an institution, but has a wider sea change margin to it. And we are very fortunate that in the UK, the Athena Swan people that have been focused primarily on women, our program is more inclusive and diverse with all underrepresented groups. Um, but we've learned a lot from them. It now exists throughout the UK and Australia, and we are working very closely with them in launching this in the USA.
I was going to ask you about that project as our next step and talking about ways that it might actually help with sustainability there. Can you said that that's getting underway. Can you talk about the time frame for that in terms of launching and getting people involved?
Yes, I suppose this is our kind of first public announcement about this.
Great.
We're hoping to have an article in Science Magazine later in the spring. Um, to be honest, we're just waiting to hear the final okay about this from a major funder that I can't mention at the moment, but we did get some early pilot funding from the National Science Foundation, and I want to say thanks to them, and also from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. We had an initial workshop um, about 11 months ago that brought together 10 different schools, universities, public and private institutions, 8 of which have joined the pilot program, and they are beginning to work for the bronze level award. We're working out the kinks on this right now as we speak. I'm going to be flying to the UK next week and working with the Athena Swan people to really understand how they do their assessments and do their awards. One thing that we've already learned from the Athena Swan people that I hope we can translate um, back to Washington in our national platform is that there needs to be some accountability measures. What they've learned in Athena Swan is that um, by handing out bronze awards, they make it clear to the institutions that in order to retain their status and go for the silver awards, um, they have to not just create a plan and implement it, but that their future federal funding for scientific grants will will be tied to their success in fulfilling that mission. So it's both a carrot and a stick kind of process,
Right.
and we don't know how that will work yet in the United States. We've had a lot of carrots. Um, um, I don't like to use the metaphor of sticks because I'm a very nonviolent person myself. But what I would like to say is that it makes sense, just like you hold corporations accountable for the quality of their products, to meet OSHA requirements and other types of requirements, lead requirements, and we hold universities accountable for what they're teaching and curriculum, etc. That we have to hold our nation for its own sake, as you mentioned earlier, for reasons of both economic productivity and national security, that we need to find ways that take this seriously and that link together the metrics of what you achieve in your institution, and that also the funding that you get um, through federal grants will be tied to how well you're doing on the Sea Change diversity scale.
So there needs to be financial accountability, you think, in order for these larger scale projects to really take off?
I do. I say that not just as an economist, but we value what we measure in the United States. We're a very pragmatic nation. And people need to think of how to create the new bottom line here that will really be meaningful. Um, and it has to do also, I just want to say, with parts of the population that have felt outside of science and achievements. Um, I mean, one of the things that I think we need to realistically think about when we think about that old type manufacturing jobs are probably not going to be coming about in the numbers that they used to be, for sure. But how do we get retraining for those people and those low income communities to be part of, let's say, environmental designed new sources of energy? They have the wisdom and the skills to do that. They need the training and the investment. Um, how do we make that happen? And perhaps seed change can be a lever in having investment go very wisely to places that could really benefit from that. So I think we're talking about a very large sweep here in our country. I think we have a challenge. And again, I think some other countries we can look to. I'll give you an example. In Ecuador, which is not what we think of as one of our chief competitors in the world, but 35% of all electrical engineers in Ecuador are women. We are nowhere near that in this country, but they had a minister of education about 50
Excuse me a
years
second.
ago who could
Go
who
ahead.
could who could who advocated to increase the numbers of women because she didn't want to leave that talent behind. And I think that is the major question here in Sea Change. How do we make sure that every talented worker, every talented kindergartner, every talented senior in college, every talented um, person in midlife can find a way to be retained and sustained in STEM?
So this is interesting to me because it's almost like, in a way, comparable to the example of a carbon tax in the sense of bringing out a hidden cost of sort of not bringing in this diversity.
I think that's a very wise way of putting it, Vanilla, that um, there are costs. We often don't measure them. And until we measure those costs of what the loss of inclusion is, it's not very convincing. It's something that you had said earlier. So perhaps you and I together and with other Sigma Xi people and with our larger audience, um, could be thinking about how can we collect the kind of data that's necessary to create a convincing argument about what the private and social costs are for not doing a good um, counting, understanding, cost benefit analysis of what the costs are of not being inclusive. And it's also part of our mission as being a democratic country. We want to welcome everybody. And what does that mean in terms of changing the structures of the workplaces? For instance, good work family policies, flexibility, giving more people the kind of early training and ongoing all through life adult training so that we can keep our people vibrant and connected in these fields.
So to ask you a couple more detailed questions about this Sea Change, Sea Awards, STEM Equity Achievement Awards that you're working on, I'm wondering if when people are going for the Bronze Award, when they're setting up programs at their institutions, is part of the process actually institutionalizing the role of increasing diversity as part of people's job descriptions, as part of their metrics, rather than just having it be sort of volunteer committee work that people are expected to fit in on the side, because that's often what happens in institutions.
Exactly. It's how to, in a smart way, integrate those metrics in the same way that you do when you're measuring people when they're coming up. I'm just using my example in university for tenure. You're looking about where they publish. You're looking at the quality of their teaching, noted by student evaluations, etc. So what we're talking about here are hard measures, and we're also talking about cultural shifts. So we're talking about bringing in people that are training people. You had mentioned earlier that often it's unconscious bias. Sometimes people, we know this, are not aware of or familiar how their pattern of behavior um, is exclusive. We see this, we have a lot of studies about this, how women are reporting a lot of sexual discrimination, sexual harassment. This is very rampant in our society. And many men are just unaware or unfamiliar with what these patterns are. Micro level biases is something that my own institution, UMass Lowell, is looking at right now, um, and how that can be understood. And we're very fortunate that we have some very interesting leaders. Our Dean of Engineering, for example, um, is a feminist male who understands very importantly that he needs to bring in people to train all of his department chairs on this, and also to have their participation in coming up with some of the metrics that you mentioned, Fenella. In other words, it's much more successful when you're going for the bronze, and we'll be doing this pilot project starting this spring with our 8 national schools. We will be setting up a board of advisors of both corporate and university people to serve on that board so we can learn from each other. But it's to have the participants themselves create the measures that they're going to be held to in accountability. That way, it's not as if it's been something externalized that comes in, which you resent and don't want to follow, but rather something that you own. And we know from experience in other areas that that ground level participation is the key in this, and that's where we will be starting.
So I did my undergraduate degree in computer science at Duke University.
Congratulations.
And I'm just remembering back to my experiences doing that in terms of being one of few women in the class. I did electrical engineering as well. Um,
Can you say
but
where you were? Were you in an all women's school? Or were you in a
no,
co-ed
I was
school?
I was at Duke University.
Oh,
So
yes. Mhm.
so it's definitely co-ed. But um, yeah, so I was definitely minority in most of those classes. But one of the things that I noticed about the culture there, which was subtle but which was obvious, was that it seemed to be that the assumption was either you got it or you didn't, and there
Mhm.
was no in between. So if you didn't quite get it to start with, or if you needed more time to get there, or if you needed a different kind of instruction, it just was not embraced. So I'm wondering if this is a kind of institutional change that you hope your project might also address.
Oh, I love that. It's not something I've had to say that I've thought through specifically in terms of sea change, but I think we should bring this in, and perhaps we can talk more. Um, I think you are disclosing something that's very important, and that is the trap of binary thinking. Um, it's something that we're seeing in many instances now about sexual identity and the need for more fluidity and acceptance. In transgender issues and other related issues. Um, and when you are talking about it's kind of it's either pink or blue, or it was good or bad, or it was a yes or no. That those ways of thinking are not necessarily the best. Sometimes they're necessary, but they're not necessarily the best for for people to learn in that type of environment. And people need to, again, going back to encouragement, if people are thinking in different ways or outside of the circle or outside the square, they need to be encouraged in that type of way. And um, there was a famous book written about people in computer science. It was called Opening Up the Clubhouse. And it was done by two people at Carnegie Mellon who just saw this slipping away of women and underrepresented groups because they weren't doing it the same old way that the old white boys had always done it in the clubhouse. And when this book came out, there were many, many examples from the students of how this could be made better. So one of the things that you raised, Vanilla, is, you learned from that experience. Um, you know, I'm sure you would have had, and you still do have, some ideas of how that could have been done in a better way to be more inclusive. And we need to get to that level and then find out how to share that information so that not just Duke would embrace that, but that it would be something that would become standard practice in ways of thinking, ways of knowing that allowed, again, that kind of creativity to really flourish. And that can take on different shapes, different ways of thinking in different modes of operation.
Right. Well, I have to say that this was 20 years ago, so I think Duke has made some strides since then. I have to give them credit.
I meant that more metaphorically, but you understand. I mean, but I have to say there are many places that still are operating the way they did 20 years ago, in many ways, and many of our institutional policies have been quite stuck, which is why those numbers that we talked about in the beginning of our conversation haven't moved in the dramatic way that we would want them to move. Um,
Right.
and so I think that um, thinking through that and what would it, let's ask a question together. I mean, how, if Duke has changed, in what ways has it changed, and how did they institutionalize that, and how did they move beyond binary thinking? Those are the kind of things that we need to know, and maybe do community service and public service um, announcements about that, so that they can be translated and learned by many, many others.
Right. I just want to remind the audience that if you do have questions, please enter them into the chat box window so we can ask them to Dr. Raymond. We're running short on time, so if you have those, please do put them in. Um, and so, Dr. Raymond, one of the other things I think that your awards are trying to do is help to increase visibility, because I know just from being on Twitter, for instance, that the number of Black women scientists out there is quite large, but their visibility is certainly not equal to the number of Black women scientists present there. One of the concerns I've often seen is it just in terms of how do you sort of open this foot in the door for recognition? How do you recognize and find people who have not already received recognition? Because as you know, this tends to be a snowball effect. Somebody gets invited as a speaker, and then somebody else says, oh, this person was invited as a speaker, let's invite them as well. How do you help that sort of initial invitation, that initial recognition to happen?
Well, I think just what you're doing, for example, and I applaud you, Sigma Xi, of inviting different people, of having these chat rooms, of having people discuss these ideas, giving visibility um, to not just people like myself, but the wide range of people that you've had as your distinguished lecture series. Willie Pearson Jr. was a person who kind of attached me to you, and I thank Willie for doing that. And we've been colleagues for years across different divides. Um, I think that there are small ways, I would say, like that, but I think there needs to be both what I would call, this is for all social change movements. You need to have a kind of bottom up, um, multi-level, community-based way of recognition of people, of what they're doing in their own local schools, in their own communities. Um, there can be professional level organizations that hand out awards. And one of the reasons we're so pleased that AAAS has taken this on is that they're, our largest national scientific organization. They represent people around the globe. Um, that when we have our first bronze award, and I hope we can feature that way, so that's in some way with you, um, that the people that received the first bronze awards, we had been hoping that this would be a White House event. Um, I that's a challenging notion at the moment, but it's an important notion because if people in Congress are serious about economic productivity and national security, then having all of our people involved in STEM fields is not a luxury, it's a necessity. And we would want this to be embraced by the people in Congress. Yes, the Black Caucus, yes, the Women's Caucus, um, yes, historically black colleges, et cetera, but more importantly, by the wide range of people who represent the people in Congress and in our nation. And we need to have that top-down recognition, and we're hoping that Sea Change Awards can achieve that, as well as kind of the bottom-up approach. This is not going to happen overnight, but I would very much like to come back and talk with you again if you're around and
Of
Sigma Xi.
course.
Let's see, let's see in 2 years where we are and what we've accomplished. And we're in a kind of marathon right now to make this happen. We don't want to wait to the year 4200. So let's try to do this while we are still walking this earth. And I invite anybody who sees this production and presentation, if they have any ideas, thoughts, um, examples from their own institutions, it would be wonderful to share them.
So we just have one closing question here from the audience that might be good to sum up with. It asks, in light of your experience, are you hopeful? Are we making progress?
Um, I am. I used to be accused of being optimistic. I would say um, one of the joys of aging is that you get to embrace hopefulness and being neither a pessimist or an optimist because they're, I think they're too rigid. Hopefulness really opens up the sense of not only a yes, we can spirit, but there's really no other way, I think, to walk through life than knowing that, I am doing my little share of trying to walk up the mountain and that we all need each other to do this. And so, in a nutshell, to the person yes, absolutely, I am incredibly hopeful. I am now the grandmother of 11, um, in addition to our 5 children. And I want this world ahead to be inclusive to all of them, and to that they can feel a sense of being part of the kind of society that we've really been describing today, which is one where there is a true politics of belonging for everyone. And we certainly want this in all of our STEM fields as well. So, yes to hopefulness.
Great. Well, we are running out of time here, so let me just say thank you so much for spending the time with us. We very much appreciate it. I hope we can check back with you and do this again.
It would be a pleasure, Fenella,
Okay.
and thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Raymond. Thank you. And thanks to everybody who participated today.
Thank you.
Great.
Bye-bye.
Bye.